He gave up a 15-year marriage and 2 daughters for a woman he met online. She told him she was 28, childless, and ready for forever. But weeks after their wedding in the Philippines, her real age, hidden children, and a trail of past husbands came crashing into the light. And the man who thought he'd found paradise, he ended up in prison. Lucas Grant had the kind of life that most people only saw on glossy magazine covers or real estate billboards. At 42, he was one of Scottsdale's most successful property developers, a man who turned barren desert lots into luxurious neighborhoods. His name was whispered in business circles, his projects praised in industry publications, his bank account more than comfortable. From the outside, it looked like he had conquered the American dream. A spacious home, a fleet of cars, vacations in Cabo or Aspen whenever he pleased. His wife, Maya, his 2 teenage daughters, Ava and Lily, together they presented the perfect picture of a family that had it all. But wealth has a way of masking the cracks until they suddenly spread wide open. For Lucas, the life he had meticulously built felt more like an empty shell. Money could pay for elegance and comfort, but it could not buy back the warmth of a glance, the spark of connection, the laughter echoing through a once vibrant household. Behind the gates of his mansion, there was a silence that even the soft hum of fountains or the glow of chandeliers could not disguise. The truth was simple. Lucas was successful in every arena except the one that mattered most, the bonds at home. As he lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling in his king-sized bed, a thought gnawed at him. Is this all there is? He had built luxury for strangers, but couldn't build lasting intimacy with the woman who had stood by him for 15 years. He drove past neighborhoods he had designed, each house representing his triumphs, yet he returned each evening to a home that felt more like a hotel lobby, polished, pristine, and hollow. And so begins the story of a man who already had everything but convinced himself he had nothing. A man who traded stability for excitement, loyalty for novelty, family for fantasy. The decision that would unravel his world did not happen overnight. It was a slow erosion, a restless heart, an unchecked temptation, and a hunger for validation. All it took was one click, one late-night detour on the internet, to set in motion a chain of events that would carry him across the ocean and eventually into the hands of a justice system thousands of miles from home. At first glance, Lucas's path reads like a story of romance, a lonely man finding unexpected love in a digital age. But beneath the surface, it's a darker tale. Of deception finely woven, of choices made in desperation and pride, of lies that entangle not just 2 people, but entire families. It is a cautionary saga about how easily perception can be manipulated when the heart longs for something it cannot find in reality. Imagine this. You've spent decades building an empire, yet the applause fades when you step into your own kitchen. You pour drinks in solitude, scroll through your phone for company, and wonder when life lost its color. Then, out of the blue, a message appears from a stranger halfway across the globe. She laughs at your jokes, listens to your complaints, and calls you by name in a tone that feels like a song. Suddenly, the world doesn't seem so bleak anymore. For Lucas, this wasn't just companionship, it was oxygen. The trap of paradise begins like that. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't storm, it drifts in like a tide you don't notice rising until you're swept away. And when Lucas boarded a flight bound for the Philippines, he believed he was escaping emptiness. What he didn't realize was that he was exchanging one kind of prison for another, an invisible cage built from lies, manipulation, and his own blindness. This series will peel back each layer of his descent, from the sterile silence of his Arizona home to the fervent promises of online romance, from a whirlwind wedding in Cebu to the shocking discovery of a double life, and finally to the echoing corridors of a prison cell where he had years to ask himself the question, was I a victim or the architect of my own downfall? Stay with us, because the truth of Lucas Grant's story is not straightforward. The deeper we go, the more blurred the line becomes between predator and prey, between choice and trap. And what may seem like a cautionary tale about one man's mistakes could just as easily be a mirror held up to anyone willing to gamble love against logic. From the outside, Lucas Grant's life was a model of achievement. He had transformed empty Arizona landscapes into thriving residential communities, and in doing so, carved out a reputation as a visionary in real estate. He moved among the wealthy and powerful of Scottsdale, celebrated for his developments, admired for his taste. His home, perched on a hillside, overlooked a glittering pool and the endless desert horizon, a picture postcard of success. But if one stepped inside that home, the illusion quickly unraveled. Behind the polished facade, there was an emotional distance that years of comfort had quietly deepened. Lucas's marriage to Maya, once filled with energy and shared purpose, had become mechanical. They had been together 15 years, raising 2 daughters, Ava, 17, with a sharp mind and ambitions for college, and Lily, 15, a quiet, creative soul who filled sketchbooks with drawings. They were good kids, and in many ways, Maya had become the anchor of their world. She managed the household, guided the girls, and devoted herself increasingly to community causes, fundraisers, volunteering, hosting events for local charities. Lucas admired her commitment, but as Maya's attention shifted outward, the space between them widened. They spoke less of dreams and more of logistics, who was driving Ava to her debate tournament, how the bills were scheduled, what needed to be fixed around the house. Their dinner conversations that once ran late into the night had been replaced with the hum of phones and the clatter of utensils. For Lucas, each business triumph seemed to make the silence at home louder. He could close multi-million-dollar deals in conference rooms, commanding respect from contractors and investors. But when he walked through the door of his own house, he often felt invisible. Maya greeted him warmly, but there was a practiced politeness in her tone, not the spark he remembered from their early years. He would watch her smile at neighbors during a charity auction and realize with a sting that it had been years since she smiled at him that way. Marriage, he told himself, was supposed to evolve. Passion gave way to partnership, fire to steady warmth. But what he and Maya had was not warmth. It was indifference. They lived parallel lives under the same roof, intersecting for holidays and family events, but rarely meeting where it mattered. The truth was that Lucas bore responsibility too. His work consumed him, always chasing the next development project. He had missed countless dinners, school plays, late-night talks. When Ava was 12, she asked him to attend her first big recital, and he'd promised he would. Instead, a last-minute deal pulled him away, leaving an empty seat in the front row. That memory haunted him, a reminder of the many small moments he had sacrificed in the name of success. Yet, as the years passed, he also began to resent the very distance his choices had created. He blamed Maya for being distant, though he had often been the one absent. And rather than confronting these feelings, he buried himself deeper into work. Nights at the office stretched longer, weekends filled with site visits and client dinners. The more he avoided the problem, the wider the rift grew. Maya noticed. She felt his withdrawal. But she too had grown tired of trying to bridge the gap. She poured her energy into the community where her efforts were appreciated. With friends and neighbors, she found the affirmation Lucas no longer gave her, and in turn, she gave him a kind of quiet permission to disappear into his business world. They existed in a fragile balance, no open hostility, but no intimacy either. For Ava and Lily, the tension was unspoken but palpable. They saw their parents pass like ships in the night, polite exchanges at the dinner table masking the absence of true connection. The girls had grown accustomed to it, even if deep down it unsettled them. Lucas often replayed the early days of his marriage in his mind. The first years when he and Maya scraped by on modest savings, dreaming together of a future. They used to share midnight pizza while sketching ideas for homes on napkins. She had believed in him when few others did, standing by his side as he took risks that could have sunk them. That bond once felt unbreakable. Now it felt like someone else's life, a distant memory blurred by time and routine. And so, Lucas carried an emptiness he could not name aloud. To the world, he was a man who had won the game of life. To his family, he was a provider, distant but dependable. To himself, he was a man stranded in a house too big, a marriage too cold, a life too hollow. The quiet despair of his home life created the perfect opening. Vulnerability has a way of finding outlets, and when an alternative appeared, a voice offering laughter, curiosity, attention, Lucas would be unprepared to resist. What he mistook for fate was really the culmination of years of avoidance, a hunger for connection that had been neglected for too long. The stage was set. The next chapter of his life would not be found in boardrooms or family dinners, but in the glow of a computer screen, late at night, when a message from a stranger across the ocean would promise him everything he thought he was missing. It was another late night in Lucas Grant's Scottsdale office, the kind of night where silence felt heavier than the desert air outside. The glow of his computer screen was the only light, casting long shadows across blueprints and financial reports. He had long since stopped checking the clock. The house he returned to after these nights was quiet, Maya asleep in the other room, the girls tucked away in their own worlds. The emptiness of that routine gnawed at him. Scrolling mindlessly through websites, half in search of distraction, half out of boredom, Lucas stumbled onto something he hadn't been looking for. A dating site geared toward connecting Western men with women in the Philippines. At first, he lingered on the page out of curiosity more than intent. Rows of smiling faces stared back at him, bright profiles promising companionship, kindness, love. The banner at the top claimed, "Real connections, real love." He almost laughed, but beneath that chuckle was something raw, a hunger that had been left unspoken for too long. On impulse, Lucas created a profile. He hesitated at the question that asked about his marital status. Married was the truth, but he didn't type it. Instead, he clicked divorced. In that moment, he told himself it was harmless, a convenient fiction to simplify the introduction. But in truth, that small dishonesty was the crack that would split open everything that followed. Messages flooded in almost immediately. Dozens of women eager to chat, their greetings enthusiastic, their interest clear. Lucas skimmed them at first, skeptical of the sheer volume. Many seemed generic, copy-paste lines with little depth. He was close to closing the page when one stood out. Her name was Isabel Reyes. Her profile picture was elegant, professional, with a warm smile that didn't look forced. Her description wasn't the typical string of clichés. She wrote about her work in hotel management, her love of cooking, her curiosity about other cultures. Her English was fluent, even polished, but more importantly, her questions felt real. She didn't ask what kind of car he drove or how big his house was. Instead, she typed, "What makes you happiest when you're not working?" The simplicity of that question disarmed him. No one had asked him something like that in years, not Maya, not even his daughters. Lucas found himself typing back. First cautiously, then with more ease. He told her about his passion for architecture, his love of hiking in the Arizona mountains, even his frustrations about feeling invisible in his own home. Isabel responded with warmth, encouragement, and curiosity. She laughed at his dry humor, sent playful emojis, and shared her own stories about life in Cebu. Their first conversation lasted until the sun rose over the desert, and when Lucas finally shut his laptop, he felt lighter than he had in months. Over the next few weeks, their chats became a routine. What started as short exchanges evolved into long, nightly conversations. They messaged through the day, then shifted to video calls in the evenings. On camera, Isabel was everything her profile promised. Engaging, attentive, radiant. She asked about his childhood, his goals, his fears. She seemed genuinely interested in the man beneath the successful exterior. And Lucas, who had grown accustomed to polite indifference at home, soaked up every bit of attention. Isabel shared parts of her own life as well. She spoke of her demanding work schedule at a hotel, of colleagues who admired her, of her hope to someday manage her own resort. She said she was 28, never married, no children. She painted herself as independent, yet longing for someone to share her life with. Her story sounded plausible, even admirable. But there were inconsistencies. Small details Lucas brushed aside. Photos she posted sometimes had timestamps that didn't match her claimed schedule. Occasionally, he caught a glimpse of something in the background of her video calls. A child's toy, a family photo, items she quickly moved out of frame. He told himself it was nothing. After all, everyone had their quirks, their private corners. It wasn't just her words that captivated him. It was the way she made him feel. With Isabel, he wasn't a developer or provider. He was simply Lucas. She called him charming, funny, even handsome. She reminded him of a version of himself he thought had long since disappeared. And then came the first test. Isabel mentioned her grandmother had fallen ill, a sudden hospital bill looming. She didn't ask for money directly, but the weight in her voice was clear. Lucas offered without hesitation. It wasn't much at first, a few $100 wired through an online transfer. She thanked him profusely, insisting she would repay him someday. He didn't think twice. In his mind, this was what partners did. They supported each other. The requests were rare and always wrapped in reluctance. A car repair, a sudden rent increase, a temporary job setback. Each time, Isabel assured him it was temporary. Each time, Lucas reached for his wallet. To him, these weren't transactions. They were gestures of love, proof of his devotion. What Lucas failed to see was the pattern forming, the hooks being set deeper with each exchange. He rationalized it as normal in a long-distance relationship, part of building trust. Yet beneath the surface, the balance between affection and obligation was slowly shifting. As months passed, the bond between them solidified. Lucas started to imagine a future with Isabel. He pictured her walking through the halls of his Arizona home, cooking in his kitchen, sitting at the dinner table with Ava and Lily. The fantasy felt more real to him than the cold silence he endured with Maya. But reality is never as simple as it seems on a glowing screen. What Lucas mistook for love was carefully staged, a play designed to draw him in, piece by piece. While he believed he had found the one person who truly understood him, Isabel had her own reasons for keeping him hooked. The stage was set, the curtain rising on a romance that looked like salvation to Lucas. What he didn't realize was that this was the first act in a much darker play, one where he was not the leading man, but the mark. The months that followed blurred into a rhythm Lucas Grant hadn't felt in years. Every morning, his phone buzzed with messages from Isabel Reyes. Every night, the glow of his laptop brought her face into his Scottsdale office as though she were sitting across the desk. For a man who had grown accustomed to silence at home, this constant stream of affection felt intoxicating. Their conversations covered everything: favorite childhood memories, dreams for the future, frustrations about work. Isabel told him she longed to travel, to see the world, to build a new life with someone who truly understood her. Lucas shared his own unspoken disappointments, the loneliness of a marriage that had cooled, and his fear of becoming invisible in his own family. He had never been this vulnerable, not even with Maya in their best years. With Isabel, nothing felt off limits. They laughed, they teased, they stayed awake until dawn, discussing everything from food to philosophy. The sparkle in her eyes through the camera lens was enough to convince Lucas he had found a woman who not only cared for him, but saw him. The relationship deepened quickly. Within weeks, Isabel was calling him my future. She daydreamed aloud about walking through Arizona neighborhoods hand in hand, of building a home together that was theirs, not his alone. Lucas, who once saw himself as a weary husband trapped in routine, now felt like a man in his 20s again, eager, alive, hopeful. But woven through the romance were moments that should have given him pause. The first came in the form of a small emergency. Isabel mentioned her grandmother had been rushed to the hospital. She didn't ask him directly for help, but her voice carried the weight of worry. Lucas, without hesitation, offered to cover the expenses. The gratitude that poured from her afterward felt so genuine, so heartfelt, that he convinced himself it was simply what any man in his position would do. Weeks later, it was a job issue. Isabel claimed the hotel where she worked was undergoing cutbacks, and she was struggling to cover her rent. Again, she never outright asked. She just explained her situation in a soft, almost embarrassed tone. Lucas stepped in once more, telling himself these were small acts of kindness, proof that he was serious about her. Each favor seemed minor in isolation, but together they formed a pattern. Over time, the transfers added up, hundreds here, thousands there. Lucas rationalized it as investment in their future, no different from fixing a roof on a house he intended to live in. What he didn't see, or chose not to see, was how skillfully these requests were spaced, each one arriving at just the right moment. When the relationship felt strongest, when his emotions were highest, Isabel introduced another hurdle, another temporary setback he could solve. The cycle repeated: problem, support, gratitude, intimacy. Lucas believed it was trust. In reality, it was conditioning. Friends noticed his distraction. Nate Park, one of his project managers, joked over drinks that Lucas was acting like a teenager again, always checking his phone, smiling at messages no one else could see. "Don't let this get in the way of work," Nate warned. Lucas brushed it off, insisting everything was under control. But in truth, his focus was slipping. He canceled meetings, missed deadlines, and spent hours locked in video calls instead of reviewing contracts. Back home, the gulf between him and Maya widened into a chasm. She saw the late-night calls, the locked office door, the new password on his laptop. Though she didn't yet know the details, she felt the betrayal seeping into their home. Ava and Lily noticed too, their father more distant than ever. Lucas sensed the tension, but told himself it was temporary. Once Isabel moved to the United States, everything would fall into place. In his mind, the story had already been written. He and Isabel would marry, start over, build something real. The life he had with Maya was a closed chapter, a mistake he had lingered in for too long. Isabel represented not just romance, but reinvention, a second chance at happiness. The irony was that Lucas had always prided himself on spotting risks in business. He could walk through a half-finished development and see the flaws others missed: weak foundations, design errors, faulty wiring. Yet when it came to his personal life, he ignored every red flag waving in front of him. The oddities in Isabel's stories, her job she never seemed to physically attend, the blurred details about her family, the objects in the background of her calls, all were dismissed. Lucas told himself love required trust, that doubt was poison, and that to question Isabel would be to sabotage the very thing keeping him afloat. So he doubled down. More calls, more transfers, more promises. He began looking at flight options to Cebu, fantasizing about finally closing the gap between them. The thought of holding her hand, of proving to himself and the world that this relationship was real, consumed him. What Lucas could not know then was that the fast-burning flame he nurtured was consuming more than just his time and money. It was hollowing out his ties to family, to business, to the very identity he had built. And the deeper he sank into the illusion of Isabel's love, the closer he drew to the moment when the fantasy would fracture. For now, though, Lucas was convinced he had found salvation. The man who once felt invisible believed he was finally seen. What he didn't realize was that he wasn't the author of this story at all. He was the character being written line by line in someone else's script. For months, Lucas Grant lived two separate realities. By day, he was the respected developer in Scottsdale, Arizona, the man colleagues called a visionary, the one investors trusted with millions. By night, he was the devoted partner, pouring his heart out to a woman across an ocean. Those two identities clashed more violently with every passing week, and eventually the double life cracked wide open. It began with suspicion. Maya, his wife of 15 years, had long sensed the change. Lucas was glued to his phone at odd hours, disappearing into his office for hours under the excuse of late work. She noticed the light under the door, the muffled sound of his laughter in the middle of the night, the way he turned his screen away whenever she entered. She didn't want to believe the worst, but patterns have a way of speaking louder than denial. The moment of confirmation came one ordinary evening when Maya scrolled through the family phone plan's call logs. There it was, repeated numbers with international codes, calls stretching into the early hours. The name that appeared most often was one she had never heard before, Isabel Reyes. Maya didn't confront him right away. Instead, she carried the knowledge in silence, the kind that poisons the air of a home. Meals became tense. Conversations turned clipped. Even Ava and Lily, though they didn't know why, could feel the shift. Finally, when the truth could no longer be ignored, Maya confronted Lucas. "What are you hiding?" she demanded, her voice steady but heavy with betrayal. Lucas froze. For weeks, he had built a fantasy so strong that he almost convinced himself it wasn't betrayal at all. He tried to explain that he was unhappy, that Isabel was different, that she understood him in a way Maya hadn't in years. But his words landed like blows. For Maya, this wasn't just about an affair. It was about 15 years of loyalty and sacrifice crumbling in an instant. She reminded him of the nights she'd stayed up waiting for him. The risks they'd taken together to build his career, the family they'd raised. To Lucas, those memories now felt like chains. To Maya, they were vows he had shattered. Ava and Lily overheard more than he realized. Teenagers are sharper than parents often admit. Ava, once proud of her father, couldn't bring herself to speak to him. Lily, the quieter one, cried in her room, sketching furious lines into her notebook. The bond Lucas had with his daughters fractured overnight, and no apology could mend it. In the weeks that followed, the house felt like a battlefield. Silence became a weapon, and every interaction was laced with bitterness. Maya, unwilling to endure the charade, told him plainly, "If you want her, then go. But don't think you can keep us too." That ultimatum shook Lucas, but instead of pulling him back, it pushed him further toward Isabel. He told himself it wasn't betrayal if the marriage was already broken, that he deserved happiness, that starting over was better than living in a hollow shell. So he made his choice. Lucas filed for divorce. The papers were signed with a finality that reverberated through the walls of their once shared home. Maya was heartbroken, but resolute. The daughters stayed with her, cutting off communication with their father. In one stroke, Lucas severed the ties of his old life. Then came the financial leap. Years of savings, funds once meant for the family's future, began to drain away. Flights, gifts, cash transfers, over time, the total climbed to more than $180,000. Lucas justified every dollar as an investment in his new beginning. He told himself that love required sacrifice, And what greater proof could he offer Isabel than this? At last, Lucas bought a one-way ticket to the Philippines. He didn't frame it as escape. He framed it as destiny. He convinced himself that Isabel was the future, that she would be worth everything he was leaving behind. He packed his bags, stood in the doorway of the empty house he had once called home, and didn't look back. His business partners raised eyebrows. Rumors spread quietly through Scottsdale real estate circles. Lucas was distracted, reckless, burning bridges. Clients hesitated, investors grew wary. But Lucas dismissed them all. He told himself that soon he'd be in Cebu, reunited with Isabel, and nothing else would matter. At the airport, as he waited for his flight, he felt a mix of grief and exhilaration. He was abandoning a marriage, 2 daughters, and a reputation built over decades. But in his mind, he was stepping toward freedom, toward love, toward a new life untouched by the mistakes of the past. What Lucas didn't realize was that this wasn't freedom. It was surrender. He wasn't escaping emptiness. He was walking straight into a carefully constructed illusion. The paradise he believed awaited him was already cracking beneath the surface. As the plane lifted off, Arizona disappearing beneath the clouds, Lucas told himself he was finally alive. What he didn't know was that he was flying, not toward salvation, but toward the beginning of the most elaborate deception of his life. When Lucas Grant's plane landed in the Philippines, he stepped out into the thick humidity of Cebu City with his heart pounding like a man about to begin the greatest adventure of his life. The months of anticipation, the late-night calls, the endless daydreams of holding Isabel Reyes in his arms, all of it was finally culminating in this moment. He had left behind a 15-year marriage, 2 daughters, and a flourishing business empire in Arizona. But to Lucas, it didn't matter. He believed he was stepping into a new chapter, one filled with passion and rebirth. Isabel was waiting at the arrival's gate. Her smile was radiant, her embrace warm, and for Lucas, the sight of her in person erased any lingering guilt or hesitation. She looked just as she had on camera, perhaps even more enchanting in real life. In that instant, he reassured himself that all the sacrifices had been worth it. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Isabel introduced him to a small circle of friends and extended relatives. She spoke excitedly of their wedding, her words peppered with urgency as though they had no time to waste. Lucas, swept up in the euphoria, didn't question the pace. He wanted permanence, a sense of finality that would validate the choices he had made. Within weeks, arrangements were made for a modest ceremony at a parish church in Mandaue City. The building was old but beautiful, its stone walls draped with flowers that Isabel's family had gathered. The service was intimate, only a handful of her relatives, a priest, and a couple of neighbors in attendance. At first glance, everything seemed perfect. Isabel's parents smiled politely. Her aunts and uncles offered congratulations, and there was clapping when Lucas slipped the ring onto her finger. Yet beneath the warmth, Lucas felt something he couldn't quite name. Her relatives avoided eye contact when he asked questions. Their smiles felt rehearsed, their words rehearsed even more. The wedding certificate arrived shockingly fast. Lucas expected paperwork, waiting periods, perhaps bureaucratic hurdles. Instead, within days, Isabel handed him the document as if the process had been greased by invisible hands. "Things move quickly here," she explained with a soft laugh. He chose to believe her, convincing himself that perhaps this efficiency was just part of local culture. Still, the small details began to pile up. When Lucas asked to visit her workplace, the hotel she claimed to manage, she deflected. "It's far," she said one day. "Too busy," another. Once, she promised to introduce him to colleagues, only to cancel at the last moment with vague excuses. Lucas tried to brush it off, reminding himself that transitions were messy, but the truth gnawed at him. Then there were the late-night phone calls. Isabel would slip into another room, her tone hushed, urgent, and when she returned, her expression was often forced, her explanations thin. "Just a friend," she would say, or "family matter." Lucas wanted to trust her. He told himself that love meant faith, that suspicion would only poison what they had built. The most unsettling moment came during a stroll through her neighborhood. Lucas and Isabel passed a pair of women who greeted her warmly. But instead of calling her Isabel, they used another name, one Lucas had never heard. He paused, confused, but Isabel laughed it off. "Old nickname," she said quickly, tugging his hand to keep walking. The explanation was casual, but her tone betrayed a flicker of discomfort. Lucas noticed other small things, too. The photos displayed in Isabel's family home were strangely selective, as if curated to present only fragments of her life. He never saw pictures of her childhood or family milestones, only generic portraits that could have been staged. When he asked questions, Isabel redirected the conversation, often with a kiss or a joke to distract him. Despite these nagging doubts, Lucas pushed them aside. He had invested too much, emotionally, financially, and personally, to let suspicion ruin his fresh start. He told himself that every marriage required trust, that cultural differences explained the oddities, that he was simply overthinking. For a while, he managed to believe it. The honeymoon stage was filled with laughter, candlelit dinners, and whispered promises. Isabel knew how to make him feel alive, how to soothe the wounds he carried from the life he had abandoned. And Lucas clung to that feeling, desperate to believe that the paradise he sought was finally within his grasp. But paradise has a way of showing its cracks when you look closely enough. For Lucas, the red flags weren't just coincidences. They were warnings, and with every unanswered question, every deflection, every late-night call, the perfect picture he had painted in his mind began to fracture. What Lucas didn't know was that beneath Isabel's charm and beauty lay an entirely different life, one she had carefully hidden, one that had ensnared others before him, and soon a single discovery would tear away the illusion and expose the truth he wasn't ready to face. By the time Lucas Grant settled into married life in Cebu, his days followed a strange rhythm. Mornings were spent adjusting to a new country. Afternoons were filled with quiet walks or errands with Isabel, and evenings usually ended with her slipping into another room to take hushed phone calls. He ignored the unease as long as he could, convincing himself that suspicion was just the ghost of his failed marriage in Arizona haunting him. But deep down, he knew something was off. The facade began to crumble on an unremarkable evening. Isabel had left her laptop open on the desk before stepping out to take one of her mysterious calls. Lucas sat in the room, staring at the glowing screen, fighting the urge to respect her privacy. Yet the gnawing questions he had pushed aside for weeks surged back with force. Why had her neighbors called her by a different name? Why had she never once taken him to her supposed hotel job? Why did her stories shift when pressed? Curiosity overcame restraint. Lucas slid the chair forward and touched the trackpad. The browser was still open, her social media account logged in. For a long moment, he hesitated. Then, with a heavy heart, he clicked. What he saw gutted him. The timeline stretched back decades, far longer than Isabel's supposed 28 years. Photographs of birthday parties, family holidays, and graduations, each stamped with dates that didn't add up. There were children in the pictures too, always at her side, growing older through the albums. Their faces bore her features unmistakably. These weren't cousins or siblings. These were her children. Lucas scrolled faster, his pulse hammering. He found images of men, too, different men across different years. Smiling, arms draped around her, wedding photos that weren't with him, each face blurred into the next, but the pattern was unmistakable. Isabel had been married before, not once, but multiple times, and many of those men were clearly foreign, like him. The final blow came when he found a scanned birth certificate tucked into her saved documents folder. The name matched Isabel Reyes. But the date of birth? It placed her at 45 years old, 17 years older than she had claimed. Lucas sat frozen, the room closing in around him. The woman who had captivated him, who he had sacrificed his family and fortune for, wasn't who she said she was. She wasn't the vibrant 28-year-old hotel manager chasing a fresh start. She was a middle-aged woman with a hidden past, multiple marriages, and 4 children depending on her. The realization hit like a tidal wave. He had been living inside a carefully constructed illusion. The tender words, the romantic promises, the urgent requests for financial help, they weren't spontaneous gestures of love. They were part of a script, refined and repeated with men like him over the years. Lucas hadn't been chosen because he was special. He had been targeted because he was vulnerable. He printed the evidence, photos, certificates, marriage records, his hands trembling as the sheets slid out of the printer. For hours, he sat staring at the pile. Every memory with Isabel replaying in his mind, now tinged with deceit. The way she laughed, the way she looked at him on camera, the way she had promised forever, all of it poisoned by the truth. When Isabel returned home that night, she found Lucas waiting, the papers spread across the table like shards of glass. His voice was sharp, his eyes cold. "Who are you, really?" he demanded. Isabel's smile faltered, her eyes darting to the documents. For a fleeting second, panic flashed across her face. Then the mask cracked. She sat down, shoulders slumping, and whispered, "I didn't want you to find out like this." Tears followed. She admitted what Lucas already knew. She wasn't 28. She was 45. She wasn't childless. She had 4 children from past relationships, and yes, she had been married before, to other men who had also believed they were her future. Her explanation poured out in broken sentences. She claimed she never set out to deceive, that she was desperate, that life had forced her into choices she regretted but couldn't undo. Lucas listened in stunned silence, his heart a battlefield of fury and sorrow. Part of him wanted to believe her, to cling to some fragment of the woman he thought he knew. Another part of him recognized the pattern, the manipulation, the years of lies. In that moment, one truth became painfully clear. The paradise he thought he had built was nothing more than a prison of his own making, and the woman he had trusted with his future had been carrying a script of deception long before he ever walked into her life. The discovery was complete. But for Lucas, the consequences were just beginning. The evidence lay scattered across the dining table of their Cebu apartment, papers fluttering in the draft from a ceiling fan that did nothing to cool the tension. Lucas sat stiff-backed, his jaw locked, as Isabel Reyes fidgeted in her chair across from him. The laptop still glowed faintly, the incriminating documents staring like open wounds. For the first time since their whirlwind romance began, there were no playful smiles, no affectionate touches. Only silence heavy enough to crush them both. "Tell me the truth," Lucas said at last, his voice low, clipped, almost dangerous. "Who are you? Because the woman I married, she doesn't exist." Isabel's eyes brimmed with tears. For a moment, she tried to form an excuse, to spin another story, but the dam had burst. She dropped her gaze, her shoulders curling inward, and let out a sob that seemed to shake her entire frame. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted it to go this far." Piece by piece, the truth spilled out. She wasn't 28. She was 45. She wasn't childless. She had 4 children, all depending on her, and those men in the photographs, they weren't friends. They weren't casual flings. They were husbands. Foreign men like Lucas, who had fallen for the same story, the same performance. Some marriages had ended quietly, annulled when money dried up. Others had unraveled in chaos. Each one left a trail Lucas was only now discovering. Isabel claimed she had been trapped in a cycle. She insisted that life in the Philippines was unforgiving, that opportunities for women like her were scarce. "I did what I had to do," she said between sobs, "to feed my children, to keep a roof over our heads. I never wanted to hurt you, Lucas. I didn't know how to stop." Her confession was raw, yet it dripped with contradiction. Was she admitting remorse, or was this another performance, another manipulation designed to pull at his sympathy? Lucas couldn't tell. He thought about the hundreds of calls they'd shared, the declarations of love, the whispered promises of a life together. He remembered draining his bank account, signing divorce papers, walking away from Maya and his daughters. He thought about Ava and Lily, how they had looked at him with hurt in their eyes as he packed his bags. He had traded all of that for what? A fantasy spun by a woman who had played this role before? His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Do you understand what I gave up for you? My family, my home, my career, gone. I destroyed everything for you. And it was all a lie." Isabel reached for his hand, but he pulled away, her face twisted with desperation. "It wasn't all a lie," she pleaded. "At first, maybe. But then, I loved you. I still love you." The words cut deep, but Lucas couldn't believe them. He saw too clearly now, the charm, the warmth, the perfectly timed requests for help. It had all been calculated. She had studied him, learned his weaknesses, and fed him exactly what he longed to hear. He had been groomed not for love, but for control. Yet amid his fury, a sliver of doubt lingered. Was she entirely a predator, or had desperation blurred her choices until deception felt like survival? Her tears seemed real. Her trembling voice carried an edge of truth. And for a man who had built his life on believing what he wanted to believe, Lucas wasn't sure where reality ended and manipulation began. That night, Lucas barely slept. He sat in the dark, staring out at the neon lights of Cebu, replaying every decision that had led him here. He remembered Maya's ultimatum, his daughter's silence, his colleagues' warnings. He remembered convincing himself he was chasing happiness, when in truth he had been running from emptiness. By dawn, one thing was certain. The marriage was a sham, the dream shattered. But it wasn't just Isabel's lies that had ruined him. His own choices, every ignored red flag, every rationalization, had led him into this trap. The betrayal cut both ways, hers for deceiving, his for abandoning the life he once had. Still, Lucas resolved to end it. He gathered the documents, made copies, and prepared to file for annulment. He told himself he would break free, salvage what little remained of his dignity, but Isabel wasn't ready to let go. Her confession may have stripped away the lies, but it didn't erase her determination. What Lucas didn't realize yet was that this confrontation was not the end of the deception, it was only a turning point. Because Isabel, cornered and exposed, would not release him quietly. The woman who had lured him across the ocean still held cards he couldn't see, and she intended to play every one of them. The morning after Isabel's confession, Lucas Grant believed he had reached his lowest point. He thought the worst was behind him, that the truth was out, and the only step left was to leave. But as anyone who has ever stood in the wreckage of betrayal knows, endings are rarely that simple. What came next wasn't relief. It was a downward spiral that would consume him. Lucas began preparing to file for an annulment. He spoke to a local attorney, gathering documents, presenting the evidence of deception, the false age, the hidden children, the prior marriages. He believed the law would side with him. After all, hadn't he been tricked into this marriage? But what Lucas failed to understand was that he was a foreigner in a system he didn't comprehend. Cultural loyalties and unspoken rules tilted the scale against him from the start. Isabel fought back with fury. She accused Lucas of mistreating her, whispering to neighbors that he was controlling, even violent. Soon, rumors spread in the community. The man who had once been her dream husband was now painted as the abusive outsider. When Lucas tried to explain his side, his words fell on deaf ears. People chose to believe Isabel. After all, she was the daughter of the neighborhood, the woman they had known for years. He was just another wealthy foreigner who had flown in and expected to take control. Desperation grew inside Lucas. He watched as the walls closed in. Every attempt to sever ties with Isabel only bound him tighter. She threatened him with legal action, warning she would claim domestic abuse if he pushed for annulment. The thought of fighting a court battle in a foreign land terrified him. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about his freedom. Meanwhile, back in Arizona, his empire crumbled. Business partners grew weary of his absence. Investors lost patience with his erratic decisions. Rumors about his failed marriage and scandal in the Philippines seeped into boardrooms. Contracts fell apart. Partnerships dissolved. The man who had once been hailed as a titan of Scottsdale real estate now looked like a liability. Lucas turned inward. His nights were spent with a bottle instead of blueprints, his once sharp mind dulled by alcohol. He isolated himself, avoiding calls, ignoring friends. The vibrant, confident man who had closed multi-million-dollar deals was now a shadow of himself, pacing a small Cebu apartment while Isabel's presence loomed like a storm cloud. Arguments between them grew frequent, each one sharper than the last. Isabel, emboldened by his weakness, demanded more. She knew he was unraveling. She reminded him of the money he had already spent, of the family he had abandoned, of the fact that he was trapped in a country where she knew the language, the customs, the laws, and he did not. One night, the tension reached a breaking point. Isabel stormed into the apartment, furious about money Lucas refused to give. Words turned to shouts, shouts into accusations. Lucas felt years of betrayal, guilt, and humiliation boiling over. The argument spilled into the stairwell. Isabel pushed, he pushed back, and in a single tragic misstep, her body crashed against the steps with a sickening thud. The world froze. Lucas rushed to her side, calling her name, begging her to open her eyes. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale. By the time emergency services arrived, the damage was irreversible. Isabel survived, but the woman who once enchanted him was gone. The doctors explained that her brain injury was permanent. The vibrant persona she had carefully crafted was erased, replaced by a dependent, vulnerable shell. But sympathy for Lucas was nowhere to be found. In the eyes of the community, in the eyes of the law, this was no accident. It was assault. He was arrested almost immediately. Treated not as a grieving husband, but as a violent foreigner who had destroyed the life of a local woman. The media pounced. Headlines branded him a monster. American mogul abuses young wife. The story spread fast, and every detail was twisted. His transfers of money became evidence of control. His late-night calls with Isabel were reframed as manipulation. His arguments with her were painted as patterns of abuse. No one cared about the documents he had found, the lies she had spun, or the family he had abandoned for her. The public had made up its mind. Lucas was guilty. As he sat in a dim Manila cell awaiting trial, Lucas realized the true scope of his downfall. His wealth was gone, his reputation destroyed, his family back home estranged. The woman he had once loved was now incapacitated, her children left to carry the weight of her choices, and he was staring down the barrel of a justice system determined to make an example out of him. The spiral was complete. The man who had flown across the ocean in search of love had instead found ruin, shackled by his own blind faith in a fantasy. And as he waited for the verdict that would seal his fate, Lucas finally understood. Paradise hadn't just turned into a prison. He had walked willingly into the cage, and Isabel had simply closed the door behind him. The trial of Lucas Grant was the kind of spectacle that fed headlines for weeks in the Philippines. A wealthy American real estate developer accused of nearly killing his much younger wife. At least, that's how the newspapers framed it. The truth, layered with deception and betrayal, was far too complex for a front page. But in court, complexity didn't matter. Optics did. From the moment proceedings began, Lucas could sense the scales tilting against him. Isabel's family filled the courtroom benches, their eyes burning with anger. Her parents wept as they described their daughter's decline from vibrant woman to permanent patient. Her children, too young to fully understand the legal jargon, clutched each other and cried when their mother was wheeled in, silent, dependent, a shadow of the persona she had once performed so well. The prosecution painted Lucas as a violent foreigner who had come to the Philippines to take advantage of a vulnerable woman. They emphasized the money he had spent as a form of control, twisted the evidence into a narrative of exploitation, and replayed the fall on the staircase as if it were an inevitable act of rage. Every time Lucas tried to explain that the marriage had been built on lies, that Isabel had manipulated him, the court grew colder. To them, it sounded like a desperate man shifting blame onto a disabled wife. The media frenzy only made things worse. Headlines screamed, "American tycoon abuses Filipina bride." Television crews camped outside the courthouse. Reporters broadcast live updates, and public opinion hardened with each broadcast. No one cared about the falsified birth certificate, the hidden children, or the trail of past marriages. Those facts were messy, inconvenient. The cleaner story, the abusive foreigner, was the one that stuck. Lucas sat through it all, hollow-eyed and exhausted. His defense team tried to highlight Isabel's deception, but each revelation was dismissed as irrelevant. The judge listened patiently, then refocused on the incident itself. A violent altercation, a woman gravely injured. For the court, that was enough. When the verdict was finally read, the words landed like hammer blows. Guilty. 8 years in a Philippine prison. Lucas felt his stomach drop, his breath caught in his throat. 8 years. Not for a calculated crime, but for a single night when fury, despair, and betrayal collided on a staircase. He was led away in handcuffs, the cameras flashing, the whispers of the crowd hissing around him. The life he had once built, the empire of homes, the image of success, the family dinners he had abandoned, seemed impossibly far away. Inside prison, reality was harsher still. Overcrowded cells, stifling heat, days that blurred into endless monotony. For a man who once measured success in square footage and profit margins, the small, grimy concrete space was its own special torment. Here, there was no control, no status, just survival. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of his choices devastated 2 families. Back in Arizona, Maya raised Ava and Lily alone. They went through their teenage years without the father who had once cheered at their soccer games and promised to be there for every milestone. Ava graduated high school, Lily showcased her artwork at a local gallery, and Lucas missed it all. Their anger at him calcified into silence. Letters he sent were returned unopened, his phone calls ignored. Maya, left to rebuild, carried the weight of betrayal, but also resilience. She moved the family into a smaller home, picked up more work, and shouldered the role of both parents. For her, Aunt Lucas's downfall was not a cautionary tale. It was a wound she chose not to reopen. For Isabel's children, the story was equally tragic. Whatever sympathy people had for Lucas, none extended to them. Their mother, once the provider, now required full-time care. The lies she told, the manipulations she perfected, had collapsed into a reality where they were left to fend for themselves while caring for a parent who could no longer function independently. They were as much victims of her choices as Lucas was. and Isabel herself. She lived in the half-light of brain damage, no longer the calculating woman who lured men across oceans, but a dependent shell who required constant attention. The persona of Isabel Reyes, the vibrant, charming woman who had written love letters, whispered promises, and orchestrated lies, was gone. In her place remained someone unrecognizable, both victim and architect of her downfall. Lucas's 8-year sentence became his crucible. Day after day, he replayed the decisions that had led him there. Was he a victim of fraud or the author of his own destruction? He had ignored every warning, abandoned his family, and poured his future into a mirage. Yet without Isabel's deception, none of it would have happened. The truth was messier than any courtroom could capture. There were no clear villains, no pure victims, just broken people colliding in a web of lies and desperation. When asked years later what lesson he had learned, Lucas said only this: "The most dangerous lies aren't the ones strangers tell us. They're the ones we tell ourselves, because we want them to be true." And that's the haunting legacy of Lucas Grant's story, a tale where love became illusion, paradise became prison, and the price of denial was everything he once held dear.